Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
My pleasure and privilege. Can you explain what is the immune system and why does it go awry?
Okay. Well, the immune system is kind of, if you want to make a metaphor out of it, is kind of the defense department of the body. From an evolutionary standpoint, it evolved because we see it in the very primitive species to protect against outside invaders. Much of that is outside microbes or pathogens. Now, in order to be able to recognize non-self, namely something that doesn't belong in the body, it has a fine-tuning recognition system. So if it functions in a purely appropriate way, it will only recognize and fight against things that don't belong there. But it's such a sensitive system that it has the possibility of recognizing self sometimes as being foreign. And that's where you get autoimmune type diseases. So the immune system is kind of a system that can be regulated and dysregulated. So every time you get confronted by something that's noxious to you, that could be a microbe, that could be an outside protein that you make a response against. It doesn't have to be a microbe. You get into trouble, not trouble, but it gets complicated when you get the technologies that have allowed us to do things like transplantation, where you try to transplant an organ from someone, a kidney or a heart, that the body sees that as, even if you try to match it pretty well, it sees it as not necessarily its own, except if it's an absolutely identical twin. And that's when the body sees it and makes a response and you get transplant organ rejection. So the good things about the immune system is that you get a cold, a virus, the immune system jumps in, suppresses it, gets rid of it. You get a bacterial infection, it gets rid of it. The somewhat dangerous aspects of it is that it's always at that tune of possibility going awry because it's finely regulated. And if the regulatory mechanisms, either genetically programmed or what have you, go awry, you can get diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and scleroderma and vasculitis.
Do you have any feelings about genetic engineering?
I think if you're talking about germline things that are not to essentially save the life of someone, but to modify someone to be better, I am totally against. I think that's an ethical line you don't cross. But you know, when you talk about genetic modification, not germline, but things like curing sickle cell disease, you can do that by modifying the genes. So for that, I'm all for it. But to trying to say I like somebody a little taller or a little shorter, or no.
Something a little bit more mundane.
Right.
Someone has a cold. They're contagious. They expose somebody else. How long before that person develops a disease symptomatically, and during that disease, how long and when are they contagious to others?
Okay, so you've asked a broad, generic question that's applicable to maybe a couple of hundred viruses, because there are so many different viruses that cause the common cold. Coronavirus, rhinovirus, adenovirus, a variety of viruses, parainfluenza virus, et cetera, et cetera. Each of them differ, but they do have some common denominators.
There's some ranges.
Yeah, the ranges. So the common denominator is that when you get exposed, it usually is anywhere from 48 hours to a few days. It's not 2 months, and it's not 15 minutes. So it's, you usually say you sneeze on me, I got a cold. Probably the day after tomorrow or 3 days later, I'll start getting some symptoms. The other part of your question is, once I'm infected, when am I infective to others? There are some diseases, like influenza, where you can actually transmit your shedding virus even before you really start to get symptoms. And then you stop within, X number of days, even maybe you still have a little cough, but you're not shedding virus anymore. So it's usually right at the time that you're symptomatic, or maybe 24 hours before. And that's the reason why infections like influenza and others spread so rapidly, because people are relatively well when they get on the subway, when they get on a plane, when they do it. And sometimes, people do what they shouldn't do. They're sneezing and coughing, and they still go in crowded places.
Do you wash your hands every time you shake hands with people?
I can't, because there aren't enough sinks around to do that. But what I try and do is, and it's tough, is that I wash my hands a fair amount. I mean, I'm on the ward a fair amount, so I have to do that every time I go in and out of a room. In my office, I see people come in all the time, and I'll wash my hands multiple times a day. If you don't have the opportunity to do that, these liquid alcohol-based are good. It's not as good as washing with soap and water for 20 minutes, but the one thing you can do to help yourself is don't touch your face. They did an observational study and found out how many times people during the day touch their face. It's amazing how many times people touch their faces every day. So when I'm in a situation where I'm shaking a lot of hands in a reception or something, I try to consciously say, don't touch your face.
Are you concerned about airplanes?
It depends on the duration of the flight. The CDC and others have done some studies. If you get on a flight, I just flew up here from Washington, D.C. to New York. I was on, 45 minutes in the air, an hour and 10 minutes on the plane. Unlikely, unless somebody's sitting right next to me and is just really doing it. But just in the general in a plane, you really get into trouble when you do those 18-hour flights, Washington, D.C. to Tokyo, or Washington, D.C. Like I'm going to be going to the Democratic Republic of the Congo in a few weeks to check on our sites. I'm going to go Washington to Brussels, Brussels to Kinshasa, Kinshasa to Goma. I'm already counting on the fact that I'm going to come back with a cold.
How did SARS become contained?
That's an interesting question and an interesting story, because what SARS showed was that common 19th and 20th century fundamental low-tech public health measures can contain an outbreak if you do it right. So what SARS did is, SARS is fundamentally an animal virus. It went from a civet cat to a human, and you had this explosion of 8,000 cases and 775 deaths over a period of about a year and a half. And it never returned to the human species. So we were racing to get a vaccine because we thought that this was going to be another pandemic flu. We didn't know, because in the beginning, remember, Newsweek, Time Magazine, big covers, is this the next, outbreak that's going to take us all in? As it turns out, identification, isolation, quarantine, and good public health measures made it go down, 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 and it just disappeared, and it never came back.
There seem to be a lot of conditions like that. There's the Nipah virus, there's MERS,
Right.
There's all sorts of pathogens.
We are living right now today seeing that there are emerging infections all around us. Just look at what's happened within the last few years. Zika, chikungunya, West Nile, and now Ebola, Nipah, MERS, SARS. 100 years from now, when you and I are not around, there's still going to be emerging microbes. So what we need to do is realize that microbes will continue to emerge. As physicians, scientists, public health officials, we have to develop the capability of responding rapidly so that we're not preventing them from arising, because that's going to happen. We got to prevent them from becoming public health outbreaks. And that's why you have to have rapid diagnostics, vaccine platforms that can rapidly make a vaccine, not have to wait 6 to 8 months to make a vaccine. So we need to prepare ourselves for the fact that they emerge. If we try and guess, I often do this when people interview me, what is the next disease X? And I don't have a foggiest idea what it is. And the reason is because we've never predicted correctly what it was anyway. No one would have predicted Zika.
So talk about prediction.
Yeah.
How do you come up with a vaccine for influenza every year? That's a prediction.
Yeah, it is, but it's based on some science, a little bit soft, and that's one of the reasons why we want to get a universal flu vaccine, so we don't have to be guessing, even if it's an intelligent guess. So what happens is that there are a couple of factors which give you an idea of what's going to happen next year. So if you have an outbreak this year, and towards the end of the season you see that there's another strain that's starting to emerge. Many of the people will have been infected with what's this year, so they're not going to wind up getting infected again next year. So you see this other strain come in, and if that strain is one that's giving trouble in Australia, because often, not always, but often the southern hemisphere gets an outbreak and we tend to follow them occasionally. It isn't black and white math that says it all the time, but if a combination of what's hanging around towards the end of the year, what the immune profile of the population is, and what happened in the southern hemisphere, about 8 out of 10 times you get it right.
What about the current administration? How is that affecting and informing your existence?
You know, it's very interesting. It's obviously a tumultuous time, to say the least, when you think about what's going on. But we in the biomedical research arena have been relatively untouched by that. And in fact, with the budget that is fundamentally driven by the Congress, we've done very well over the last couple of years.